Years ago, I used to have this really, really crappy car. One day I got home from work, pulled in the driveway, shut the door, and the back window popped out of it. I look at this as we have this vehicle almost completely stripped down with all the doors and the tailgate blown off, and it just reminds me of that day. Welcome back to Munro Live. My name is Carl, and today we are tearing down the Hyundai Ioniq 5 here at Munro. This is a vehicle that has been purchased directly by Munro, so it's wonderful that we're not just doing a first impressions video. I don't like doing those as much because I can't really tear into things and understand what's going on. We are going to remove every nut and bolt from this vehicle, so we are going to see all the decisions that they made and the possibilities that they may have for improvement. So today we are going to review the doors and go over some basics of the door assembly. Now, starting with the actual sheet metal of the door. And doing that, let's go ahead and look at this door here. So we have the stamped sheet metal, an inner and an outer skin. We have some crash bars, reinforcement bars inside of the sheet metal steel. So what I want to understand is process. You know, when we look at individual components, we try and figure out a cost associated with the component. But it's not just the component, it's also using the component. How are we manufacturing a part? What are we wasting? So for me, I want to understand the cost. I want to understand the design decisions and the process decisions that are making something expensive. Now, in doing that, not only do I have to account for the physical part that we see, but I also have to account for the material that's being thrown away. We have to pay for all of that waste material. So anytime we're punching out, now when we're looking at the actual component, not only do I have to identify the cost of the part itself, but I also have to think about the cost of everything that's being thrown away. So we have punched holes, we have material that's being thrown away from that. So when we're looking at parts, not only do I have to identify the cost of the component itself, but I also have to account for all of the material that's being thrown away and everything that we are doing in process that is costing us money. Honestly, if you think about it, if an automotive company could get away like IKEA does by having you assemble all those components themselves, they would be saving money. Of course, they cannot do that. So I have to understand how many times are we touching this door. Now here's a good example, an easy example to follow. Look at this hinge point. You can see that there is no paint underneath that hinge. So let's look at the vehicle body. Here's the hinge, Here's the hinge attached to the body, the bolts that are securing it in place. You'll notice that there's paint over all of it. But look at those bolts that are attaching the door to the hinge. Those are not painted, which means this door was attached to this vehicle body. It was all painted at once. The door was taken back off. They went through its assembly, and then it was bolted back on using different bolts. Every time an operator must touch this door going through that process, I have to account for that in costs. Anytime I touch a part, I'm adding costs in the system, So we really want parts that go together easily, that only have to go together once. That way we don't have to touch them multiple times. So let's look at the door a little more. So we know within the door, we have the window. It is the main component that is stuck inside of this cavity. There's also some electronic components and others in there, but let's talk about that window. Here's a piece of glass. Now, at first you would think, well, why isn't this just straight across the bottom? Well, because we have to make attachment into the window regulator. Okay, well, why didn't they just make it straight here? All right, well, look at all of the weight that we were removing. So, in order for them to cut this, they're throwing away these corners. I have to account for the cost of the material that they're throwing away. So I have to account for a cost of a piece of glass which is much larger than the glass that actually made it into the vehicle. Now, why would we want to cut this away? Okay, weight. With an electric vehicle, we know that the battery range is directly affected by the weight of the vehicle. If I remove all of these little pieces of glass, I am throwing away glass that I already paid for. But I am getting weight savings. If those weight savings attribute savings within the battery of the vehicle, Like let's say I threw away $1.50 in glass, but I was able to save $3 in battery because of the weight of that $1.50. It's a net benefit. So we can't always think of something unique to that one part. We have to think of the whole system, the whole vehicle. How's it all working together? How are we really getting the savings that we assume we're going to get? Sometimes we would pay more money to save more money somewhere else. When we reviewed this vehicle, we talked about this lower portion. Now, the vehicle that we reviewed was a solid gray vehicle, but this one is a white with gray trim. This gray trim is a piece of plastic, lower cladding, lower fascia for this door. Okay, there are multiple pieces that are making up this assembly. Let's look at one of those. Here's the very bottom piece. This is a separate component which is attached to that decorative outer panel. This has attachments that are snapping back into the vehicle. It has screw attachments going into that panel. But then look at these screws here. Those are Phillips head black metal screws. There's a total of 12 of them on that component. Now, this vehicle and Rivian were basically the only two vehicles that I've looked at recently that use an actual Phillips head screw. Normally Phillips heads are not used. All right, so we have this component. It exists. There's one on every door. So I have 4 of these. I have those 12 screws. I have to purchase those screws. I have to handle those screws. I have to pick up those screws one at a time, grab my drill, and screw them in across the bottom of this vehicle. So I have to account for 48 times picking up screws. I have to account for the box of screws that's on the line. I have to account for picking up the part, putting it in place. Why is this a problem and why am I accounting for this? There's a vehicle that we recently looked at that has this same return flange, but they actually incorporated it into the outer fascia and they molded in a living hinge. So they molded the component flat. It had attachment features, locking features molded in. When they applied it to the door, they folded it and snapped it in place. One component, none of those fasteners. Across 4 doors, that's a significant amount of savings. And eliminating that tool from your assembly line and having someone pick up each of those screws, that's a lot of savings. Let's look at a few of the components that are making up the interior door panel. Now you'll see that there are quite a few layers here. We have this lower carrier, which has our mat pocket. There's a closeout, which is needed to cover the mat pocket. Now a mat pocket can normally be done 2 ways. You can have a separate A-surface closeout panel, which they chose to do here, or I could mold all of this in one A-surface component, and then I can have a mat pocket piece which is welded in from the back. Depending on your style, depending on your theme, that may actually be better. It may be worse. Think about this. There's one large component, one small component, and then another smaller component here. If I had that mat pocket, I would have one large component and then another large component welded in place. But I would have 2 rather than 3. You have to calculate across your vehicle to find out if you're actually going to get a savings or not. Then we're looking at the materials. So, polypropylene, polywarpylene, very inexpensive, very simple. A lot of components are made from that. But this is wrapped. This is wrapped with a vinyl. Look at this adhesive. See how it's kind of yellow and very stringy and splotchy? That is a solvent-based adhesive. So I have a sprayed solvent-based adhesive that I'm using to bond this vinyl. Normally, whenever you have a sprayed solvent base, this is a manual process. So I can attribute that this is a manual hand wrap process using a manual solvent-based adhesive spray. But what about some of the other wrapped components? There are differences here. Let's take a look at this upper panel. Now, this panel is thermoformed. Look at this seam. This line, which makes it look like there are two pieces of material coming together, is fake. That is just put into the thermoform. However, this line of stitching is real. Live stitch over top of a faux seam. All right, so how do we do that and how do we handle that in this process? Let me grab one of those components. Here's one I ripped apart. So, this is my formed material. That material you'll see has a thin foam backing, and it is continuous. After I formed this, I would run through and I would do a live stitch. Real stitching on top of a three-dimensional formed part. All right, how am I putting that onto this panel? I was debating what this blue adhesive layer was. At first, I was thinking, well, maybe this is a sheet adhesive. It's a sheet that's applied to the back of the part, and then that sheet is bonded to the substrate. That's wrong. I'm quite certain that this is actually a spray adhesive that was applied to the substrate, but because this is polypropylene, glue does not stick to polypropylene well, which is why when I ripped it off, I was able to rip this off in a fairly uniform sheet. Why do I think that? See this hole? That hole is a vacuum hole for removing air between this cover and the substrate when they are bonding it together. See that dot on the sheet? That is how I know this is not a continuous sheet of adhesive. This was the spray adhesive that was being ripped off, and since the adhesive did not completely fill that hole, that's why I have that little dot there. But why don't I have adhesive here? When this wraps around the edge, this is a welded component that it wraps to. There is none of that blue stuff here. There are a few automotive companies that, since they're dealing with polypropylene and a polypropylene foam, what they're able to do is actually weld on the edges. You would put this into a tool, it would vacuum down this material to the substrate, and then I would have mechanical fingers that come in, press the edge, and apply heat or vibration to weld this together. I can't really do that on the A surface because I might mess up my A surface, but all these hidden edges is fine. So this component is vac formed sheet material that then runs through a sewing machine, that then we have a substrate that gets a water-based adhesive sprayed on it. Then this goes into a tool with vacuum. The cover goes into a tool over top, presses them together, vacuum sucks it out so that they can press bond. Then fingers come in to do these edge folds, and those fingers actually weld the material on those edges without adhesive. All right, that's quite a bit of process. It's a couple of different tools, but look at this. The same solvent-based adhesive that we saw on that lower speaker cover. Why would they have a water-based adhesive plus welding plus a solvent-based adhesive? This is why. If I had a tool that had a bunch of bars and fingers on the outside, I can press in and come to a point with my tool steel. So coming from the outside in, I can seal that off. But this, I have to come from the inside out. In doing that, if I had some sort of a tool that fit inside of here and then expanded out, I would open up gaps in between my tool and I would not get even pressure. With a solvent-based adhesive, since this is a contact adhesive, I can do this wrapping without an actual tool. So they had to come back in with a manual solvent-based glue spray that, and then have someone come through here and wrap this edge. So I have to account for all of those processes when I'm making this component. My armrest has the vinyl, has a fabric, has an inside wrap, but this looks to be a brush applied on that inside wrap. This is a decorative outer band. This decorative outer band is an in-mold film. All right, well, how can I show a good example of that? Look at this corner. You see the jagged nature of this corner? I have a flat sheet of material that I am folding in on itself when it's going into the injection molding tool. In doing that, it causes these little wrinkles and ripples along those edges. If I use an in-mold film, I have to make sure that the A surface that's exposed to the customer does not give us conditions where we're going to see those folds. But on these edges which will not be exposed, those edges would be perfectly fine to have them a little rough. But look at this decorative band here. It is possible that this film was printed with these squares in place. However, the alignment of those squares, if this is a separate film, would have been very difficult. I think that this decoration was laser printed after this part was molded. They could actually use these holes as indexing into the machine to hold the part perfectly in place while a laser print had applied that decoration. So I have a film going into an injection molding machine, the part back injected from that, and then that part goes into a laser printer. All right. I have a decorative lighted band, but this is a hidden band. I'm only providing glowing. This part faces away from you in the vehicle. My wrapped band snaps in place there. My decorative band heat stakes in place here in that total assembly. So I have snap in place, I have heat stakes, and then heat stakes to the main carrier. I have to account for all of that assembly. Now, heat stakes. What really is a heat stake, and what is a vibe weld? Look at all these attachments. It was not 100 screws in order to take all this apart. These were heat stakes. So what this has is there is a molded tower on this component that passes through a hole on this component. A vibrating or sonic head comes down, hits that boss. The vibration causes that boss to melt. It melts down, creates a mushroom, and locks all these parts together. So if you were trying to fix or restore this part yourself, you would have to cut off all of those heat stakes and try and figure out a way of getting it back together. So there is no service in a system that is all heat staked together. If you went and had some sort of damage to your door, the entire door panel would have to be replaced because you're not going to be able to get this back apart easily. There will be people who will try and they'll make something work, but it's not preferable. All right, but what are our different ways of plastic welding? Heat stakes. Okay, this is a heat stake that actually has a boss or a tower. But you know how I said that that was sonic? A vibration causes that to melt? Look here. This is also a heat staking process. But rather than have an actual tower, little pins basically melt through this component and then melt into the next component. And that is how that component would have been heat staked together, without an actual tower, just on a flat surface. All right, well, how else can we do that? We can vibe weld by actually vibrating one component to another component. So if this was perfectly smooth and it wasn't covered in glue, you could put two components together and vibrate the two components to heat up the surface between them, and then when you stop, it would glue in place. I've done vibe welding a lot on glove box doors, but if you have any type of decoration on the door, you have to really plan how that's going to work with the decoration. So we have this complete door assembly, which is all welded together, which you cannot surface because you cannot get these components back apart. We have the lighted inner, which again, this is not an A-surface component. If you look on this door, which is still assembled, that is inside this cavity. So that is completely hidden from the customer. It's just providing an ambient light. But what else is unique about these rear doors? Nice screens. So, occupants in the back seat, sun isn't blaring down on them. Maybe you don't want people to be able to look in your windows and you want to hide what's in your back seat. Okay, you'd have that there. But this screen is completely manual. Here's it sitting loose. I've worked on some vehicles where we want this screen to be power. Now, there's a problem with that. You'll notice that I am not coming straight up. I'm coming up and at an angle because I'm matching the curve of the door. Having the screen loose, I can do that pretty easily. But just like pulling a string between 2 points, this is now a straight line. So I have an angled straight line with a curved door. The power units have to somewhat mimic that angle as well, which is different from the angle of the door. So it's tricky setting up a door that has a unit here, but then exits at an angle there. But a manual screen, it's really easy to do this. So when purchasing this vehicle, we established the what. We know it is this vehicle, we know that this is the content, these are the materials. Here at Munro, now we're trying to figure out the how, and then what are the results of that. So when doing the complete disassembly and complete teardown, we're actually counting every single one of those fasteners. And we're accounting for the employee on the assembly line that has to pick up that fastener, pick up a drill, put it in place. All of this adhesive, all of this layering, the different steps in the process, how many different stations are going to be necessary. We are trying to account for all of that to estimate a cost of an entire vehicle. Now, of course, we don't just do this for vehicles, we do this for all kinds of components. Some of the old stuff that they just pushed out, there's some washing machines over here, there's that old plane. But why do we do this stuff? Well, we want to understand technology, we want to understand best practices, but then sometimes we just want to understand what is real, where are these costs? We've talked about Tesla a lot, assuming that Tesla has a very profitable vehicle based on all of the components that we've seen within the Tesla and all of the different processing steps that are associated with those decisions. So for this vehicle, I'm currently working through all of those different processing steps and all of the materials to account for a total cost per system and for this vehicle. And of course, it's not just me. There are many people in here within Munro who are tearing down this vehicle. It's going to be several months until we get it completely done. So stay tuned for future videos of different commodities, different components. And if you're not subscribed, please subscribe to Munro Live. Thank you.